Hello, church. This is Pastor Paul, and I'd like to share some thoughts with you from chapter 8 of the book, The Trellis and the Vine, for Friday, July 10th, 2020. Chapter 8 is called Why Sunday Sermons Are Necessary but Not Sufficient. And in this chapter, the author discusses three different models for pastors. The first model or expectation is that the pastor would serve as a service providing clergyman. And he describes this model in this way. First, he says that the pastor is expected to feed the flock through his Sunday sermons and the administration of sacraments. Second, he's expected to organize and run the Sunday gatherings. Third, he's expected to put on various services such as baptisms and weddings. And finally, he's expected to personally counsel congregation members, especially in times of crisis. He shares some positives about this viewpoint, this model of ministry. And he says it rightly puts regular preaching of the word at the center of ministry. Second, it gathers the whole congregation as a family on Sunday for prayer, praise, and preaching. Thirdly, he says the pastor cares for his people in times of crisis. Some disadvantages of this model. He says, for a start, the ministry that takes place in the congregation will be limited to the gifts and capacity of the pastor, how effectively he preaches, and how many people he can personally know and counsel. Second, perhaps the most striking disadvantage of this way of thinking about ministry is that it feeds upon and encourages the culture of consumerism that is already rife in our culture. Perfectly fits the spirit of our age, whereby we pay trained professionals to do everything for us rather than do it ourselves. And thirdly, even the good practice of pastoral counseling can become focused on me being cared for by the pastor, such that if the assistant minister visits instead, this is not seen as adequate. The second model that he discusses is the pastor as the CEO. And in this model, the pastor is still expected to perform clergy-like functions, like we discussed in the first model. But in this model, his role becomes more focused on leading the congregation as an organization with particular goals. And he shares a few advantages of this model. He says one of the key strengths and advantages of the church growth approach has been its promotion of congregational involvement. Second, the other key strength of the church growth approach is its recognition that if the congregation is to grow numerically, more work will need to be done with the trellis or the programs of the church. And thirdly, there is no doubt, he says, that many churches have grown in the past 30 years through successfully applying church growth principles. And he shares one main disadvantage to this approach. He says many church growth churches have also accepted the consumerist assumptions of our society. Success has been achieved by providing a more attractive and broadly appealing product, but the result is not always more prayerful ministry of the word, and thus more real spiritual growth. And then we come to the third model, the model that he is supporting in this book, and that is the pastor as trainer. And he shares a few thoughts about this model. He says, first of all, in this way of thinking, the pastor is a prayerful preacher who shapes and drives the entire ministry through his biblical expositional preaching. Second, his job is not just to provide the spiritual services, nor is his job to do all of the ministry. His task is to teach and train his congregation by his word and his life to become disciple-making disciples of Jesus. Third, adding this training emphasis greatly enhances what we do in our Sunday gatherings because it builds and grows the gospel maturity of those who attend. Fourth, where the pastor is a trainer, there will be a focus on people ministering to people rather than on structures, programs, and events. And finally, pastoral care in this approach is also founded on disciples being trained to care for and disciple other Christians. Now that we've discussed these three models, I'd like to share my thoughts about this chapter. If we were to assess most churches in the United States, I would guess that most churches are expecting their pastors to fulfill the first two models. That is, they are expecting them to be professional clergymen, and they are expecting them to serve as CEOs of the church. And I would say that while pastors do need to provide vision and leadership and fulfill clerical functions, ultimately holding to these first two models hurts both the pastor and the church. As the church grows, the pastor can't keep up with all the needs of the church. The pastor is limited in his capacity to spend quality time with people. And many pastors burn out because they are trying to do something that is impossible, that is satisfying the needs and wishes of everyone in the congregation. Secondly, this makes the congregation dependent upon their pastors, and it limits their growth because they are not exercising their gifts and ministering to others. In other words, when the pastor is the only leader and the only one doing pastoral functions, the congregation becomes passive consumers. And thirdly, I would say that holding a pastor to the first two models is disobedient to what God teaches us in the Bible. In Ephesians 4:11 and 12, we read, "It was He, or God, who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service." The key, of course, in this passage is in the last part, to prepare God's people for works of service. The Bible instructs us that all believers are to be ministers doing works of service, and they are to be trained by the pastors to do that work, those works of service. So as we have been thinking about this and studying this book as a pastoral staff and as deacons, we have realized that we need to put more of an emphasis on the pastors of our church being trainers to equip you so that you will be better able to study the Bible, minister to one another, and make disciples. So this will be an important part of our vision moving forward as we try to glorify God at Danville First Baptist Church. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope that you have a blessed weekend, and I look forward to seeing many of you on Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.